Clayton Reeves came to town for 2 goats. He left with a teenage girl, wrists bound, traded by her uncle like she was nothing more than livestock. He didn't ask for her name, didn't want company. But the moment he cut the rope from her skin, everything he tried to bury his past, his guilt, his need to protect, came roaring back. And when men with badges and guns came asking questions, Clayton realized he hadn't just inherited someone else's trouble. He'd taken in someone worth fighting for. Clayton Reeves hadn't even wanted company. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty yard as Silas Ward grinned with yellow teeth, already counting coins that weren't yet in his pocket. Nora stood between them, her green eyes fixed on the ground, 16 years old, and traded away like broken furniture. Her dress, once blue, had faded to the color of old bruises, patched at the elbows with mismatched fabric. Clayton's jaw tightened as he stared at the rope in his hands. He'd come to buy goats for his ranch, not acquire a girl who looked like she hadn't eaten a proper meal in months. Her uncle shifted nervously, wiping sweat from his brow, despite the cool morning air. "She's a hard worker." Silas insisted, his voice carrying the desperation of a man drowning in debt. "Cooks, cleans men's clothes. Won't give you no trouble neither." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Clayton's eyes moved to Nora's thin frame, her shoulders hunched as if expecting another blow. When she finally lifted her gaze, he saw something that made his chest tighten. Not hope, but the absence of it. She'd learned not to expect kindness from the world. "I don't need help." Clayton muttered, his voice rough from years of speaking only to horses and cattle. But Silas was already backing toward his wagon, eager to escape before the deal could fall through. Nora's fingers trembled as she touched the rope around her wrists. She'd heard whispers about Clayton Reeves, the rancher who lived alone in the hills, who drove visitors away with cold stares and colder words. Some said he'd lost his family to fever. Others claimed he'd simply chosen solitude over the messiness of human connection. "The goats are in the pens," Silas called out, climbing onto his wagon seat. "Fair trade, I'd say. Girl's got years of work left in her." Clayton's hands clenched into fists. The casual way Silas spoke about Nora, like she was nothing more than livestock, stirred something dark in his chest. But he'd made the deal witnessed by half the townsfolk who'd gathered to watch the spectacle. As Silas's wagon disappeared down the dusty road, Clayton and Nora stood facing each other in silence. The morning breeze carried the scent of sage and distant rain, but between them stretched an ocean of uncertainty. Nora straightened her spine, squaring her shoulders with what little dignity remained. She'd survived 16 years of her uncle's cruelty, his drunken rages, and the gnawing hunger that came from being the last mouth fed. She could survive this too. But as Clayton's dark eyes studied her face, something passed between them, a recognition neither wanted to acknowledge. Both had been wounded by life. Both had learned to expect nothing from others. Clayton turned toward his ranch house, a modest structure weathered gray by countless storms. "Don't expect conversation," he said without looking back. "I keep to myself, and you'd be wise to do the same." But even as he spoke those words, Clayton couldn't shake the image of Nora's bound wrists, or the way she'd flinched when her uncle had shoved the rope toward him. Something about this arrangement sat wrong in his gut, like bad meat that refused to settle. What neither of them knew was that this day would demand choices neither was prepared to make. The rope around Nora's wrists had left red marks, but Clayton made no move to untie them as they walked toward the house. She stumbled once on the uneven ground, catching herself before he could notice. Independence had become her survival, and she wouldn't abandon it now. Clayton's ranch house squatted against the hillside like a fortress built for one. The windows were shuttered tight, despite the pleasant morning, and dust had settled on everything like a fine layer of resignation. He pushed open the front door and stepped aside, not quite an invitation, but not quite a barrier either. Nora hesitated at the threshold. The house smelled of old coffee and loneliness, with undertones of leather and something she couldn't identify. Maybe sorrow that had soaked into the wooden walls over time? A single chair sat at a rough-hewn table. One plate, one cup, one set of utensils. This was a man who'd built his life around the certainty of solitude. "Kitchen's through there," Clayton said, nodding toward a doorway. "You can figure out the rest." But when Nora tried to move past him, the rope around her wrists caught on the doorframe. She tugged at it, her cheeks burning with embarrassment, but the knot held firm. Clayton watched for a moment, his face unreadable, then pulled a knife from his belt. The blade was sharp and well-maintained, like everything else about Clayton Reeves. He cut through the rope with 2 quick strokes, and Nora felt the circulation return to her hands in a rush of tingling warmth. She rubbed her wrists, not looking at him, afraid of what she might see in his eyes. Pity, disgust, or worse, indifference. "Thank you." She whispered the words, barely audible. Clayton grunted and turned away, but not before she caught something unexpected in his expression. Not kindness exactly, but perhaps the recognition that binding another person was wrong, regardless of the circumstances that led to it. The kitchen was sparse, but functional, with a wood-burning stove that looked like it had seen better decades, and cupboards that probably held more cobwebs than food. Nora moved through the space with practiced efficiency, taking inventory of what little there was to work with. Some beans flour that might have been white, once coffee that smelled like it could strip paint. From the front room came the sound of Clayton moving about. Though whether he was settling in or preparing to leave, she couldn't tell. She'd learned to read the sounds of men's moods. Heavy footsteps meant anger. Quick movements meant impatience. Silence often meant danger. Clayton's movements were different, though. Careful, deliberate, like a man who'd grown accustomed to making no unnecessary noise. Nora found herself studying the single plate on the table through the doorway. How long had it been since this house had heard laughter, since someone had cooked a meal meant to be shared rather than simply consumed? The loneliness in this place was so thick she could taste it. Outside, she heard voices approaching. Multiple people, their words unclear, but their tone unmistakably curious. Clayton's footsteps moved toward the window, and she heard him curse under his breath. "Visitors." He muttered, though whether to her or himself wasn't clear. Nora moved to the window and peered through a gap in the shutters. 3 men on horseback were approaching the house, dust clouds trailing behind them like question marks. Even from a distance, she could see the way they sat their saddles, confident, entitled, the kind of men who believed the world owed them explanations. Clayton straightened his shoulders, and Nora recognized the gesture. She'd seen it in herself countless times. The moment when you prepare to face something unpleasant that you can't avoid. These weren't friendly neighbors dropping by for coffee and conversation. "Stay inside," Clayton said, his voice carrying a warning that made Nora's stomach clench. Whatever these men wanted, it wasn't good news for either of them. But as the riders drew closer, Nora caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. The man in the lead wore a badge that caught the morning sun, and his smile was the kind that promised trouble for anyone who couldn't defend themselves. The law had come calling, and Nora had learned long ago that the law rarely sided with girls who'd been treated like livestock. The badge belonged to Sheriff Hollis Vane, a man whose reputation for asking uncomfortable questions had made him both respected and feared throughout the territory. He dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent more years in the saddle than on foot. His weathered face, set in lines that suggested he'd seen too much of humanity's darker nature. Clayton stepped onto his porch, closing the door firmly behind him. Nora pressed herself against the kitchen wall, close enough to the window to hear, but hidden from view. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. "Morning, Clayton." Sheriff Bain said, his voice carrying the false warmth of a man conducting official business. "Heard you made an interesting trade in town today." The two men with the sheriff remained mounted, their hands resting casually near their weapons. Nora recognized the type. Deputies who enjoyed the power their positions gave them over people who couldn't fight back. Their eyes swept the property with the calculating gaze of men looking for trouble. Clayton's jaw worked for a moment before he answered. "Don't recall my business being anyone else's concern, Sheriff." "Well, now that depends on the nature of the business, doesn't it?" Vane stepped closer, his boots scraping against the wooden porch. Trading livestock is one thing. Trading people, that's something else entirely. Through the gap in the shutters, Nora watched Clayton's hands ball into fists at his sides. She'd seen that same tension in men before. The moment when words stopped being enough and violence became inevitable. But Clayton held himself in check, though she could see the effort had cost him. "The girl's uncle owed me money," Clayton said finally. "We settled the debt. Everything was legal and witnessed." Sheriff Bain nodded slowly, as if considering this explanation. But his eyes never left Clayton's face, searching for cracks in the story. Legal, maybe, but moral. That's a different question altogether. One of the deputies shifted in his saddle leather creaking. "Sheriff, maybe we should talk to the girl ourselves. Make sure she's content with the arrangement." The word "content" dripped with implications that made Nora's skin crawl. She'd heard that tone before from men who believed young women existed solely for their convenience. Her uncle had entertained visitors with similar ideas, though he'd never quite worked up the courage to act on them. Clayton's voice dropped to a dangerous register. "The girl stays inside. She's under my protection now." "Protection?" The sheriff's eyebrows rose. "That's an interesting word choice, Clayton. Protection from what exactly?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Nora realized that Clayton had just made a declaration that could change everything or destroy them both. By claiming to protect her, he'd accepted responsibility for her welfare. But it also meant admitting that she needed protection, which raised uncomfortable questions about why. From men who think a badge gives them the right to harass women. Clayton replied, his voice steady, despite the tension radiating from his frame. The sheriff's smile was thin and sharp as a blade. "Careful, Clayton. That sounds dangerously close to an accusation. And accusations require proof." Behind the shutters, Nora felt the walls of the kitchen closing in around her. She'd escaped her uncle's house, only to find herself trapped in a different kind of cage, one where her very presence could destroy the one man who'd shown her even a glimmer of decency. Clayton stepped forward, placing himself squarely between the mounted men and his front door. "I think this conversation is over, Sheriff." But Sheriff Vane made no move toward his horse. Instead, he settled back on his heels. The gesture of a man preparing for a longer stay than anyone wanted. "Actually, Clayton, I think it's just getting started. You see, we've had some interesting reports about the girl's condition when she left town. Bruises that weren't from any recent fall. The word bruises hit Clayton like a physical blow. Through the kitchen window, Nora watched his shoulders stiffen as the implications settled over him. She instinctively touched her ribs, where purple marks from her uncle's last drunken rage still bloomed beneath her faded dress. Sheriff Van stepped closer, his voice dropping to a more conversational tone. Now, I'm not saying you caused those bruises, Clayton, but taking in a girl who's been mistreated, well, that raises questions about your intentions. One of the deputies leaned forward in his saddle, a man with pale eyes and a cruel mouth. Maybe we should inspect the girl ourselves, Sheriff. Make sure she hasn't acquired any new injuries since the trade. The suggestion hung in the air like a threat wrapped in false concern. Nora's hands trembled as she gripped the window frame, knowing exactly what kind of inspection men like that had in mind. She'd seen her uncle's friends look at her the same way, like she was meat to be evaluated for freshness. Clayton's voice turned deadly quiet. Touch her, and I'll put you in the ground. The threat was simple, direct, and delivered with the calm certainty of a man who'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. The deputy's hands moved instinctively toward their guns, but Sheriff Vane raised a hand to stop them. Easy, boys. No one's touching anybody, but his eyes never left Clayton's face. Though I have to wonder, Clayton, why you're so protective of a girl you barely know. Unless, of course, you know more about her situation than you're letting on. Through the crack in the shutters, Nora could see Clayton's internal struggle playing out across his weathered features. He could tell the truth about her uncle's brutality, but that would mean admitting he'd participated in what amounted to buying an abused girl. Or he could stay silent and let suspicion fall on himself. Sil Ward's business practices aren't my concern, Clayton said finally. But the girl's welfare is now. Sheriff Vane nodded thoughtfully. Interesting. So you're admitting you've taken responsibility for her? The question was a trap, and everyone knew it. If Clayton said yes, he was acknowledging an arrangement that looked disturbingly like ownership. If he said no, he was abandoning Nora to whatever fate the sheriff and his deputies had in mind. I'm saying she's under my roof and my protection, Clayton replied. Nothing more, nothing less. Behind the kitchen wall, Nora made a decision that surprised even her. She moved to the door and placed her hand on the latch. If Clayton was going to risk himself for her sake, the least she could do was face the consequences alongside him. But before she could open the door, she heard hoofbeats approaching from the distance. All eyes turned toward the dust cloud rising from the road, and Nora saw Sheriff Payne's expression shift from confident authority to careful calculation. A rider was approaching fast, and from the urgency of his pace, he brought news that couldn't wait. As the figure drew closer, Nora recognized the young man who ran messages for the town's businesses. Tommy Briggs, barely 18, and always eager to prove his worth to the adults who employed him. Tommy hauled his lathered horse to a stop beside the sheriff's group, his face flushed with excitement and exertion. Sheriff Vane. You need to come quick. There's been trouble at the Ward place. The sheriff's attention snapped away from Clayton like a taut rope suddenly cut. What kind of trouble, boy? Fire, sir? Big one. Started about an hour after Silas left this morning. Whole place went up like it was soaked in kerosene. Tommy's eyes were wide with the drama of it all. Neighbors are saying it looked deliberate, like someone wanted to make sure nothing was left. Sheriff Bain's gaze flicked back to Clayton's suspicion flickering in his pale eyes. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say, right, after Ward made his trade? But Clayton's surprise appeared genuine, his face showing nothing but confusion at the news. Nora, however, felt something cold settle in her stomach. She knew her uncle's habits, his debts, the dangerous men who'd been circling his property like vultures waiting for death. Silas Ward had enemies, and now he disappeared with whatever money Clayton had paid him, leaving behind nothing but ash and unanswered questions. The fire changed everything. And as Sheriff Bain swung back into his saddle, Nora realized that her uncle's troubles had followed her here, bringing danger that neither she nor Clayton had anticipated. Sheriff Vane mounted his horse with the fluid motion of a man accustomed to sudden departures, but his eyes remained fixed on Clayton's face, searching for any flicker of guilt or knowledge about the fire. The silence stretched taut as a bowering until Tommy Briggs shifted nervously in his saddle. "Sheriff, there's more," the young messenger said, his voice cracking slightly. "Found a body in the ashes. Burned real bad, but he swallowed hard. Wasn't Silas warded?" The words hit like a thunderclap. Through the window, Nora felt her knees go weak. If the body wasn't her uncle's, then who had died in his place, and where was Silas now? Clayton stepped forward, his voice sharp with concern. "Who was it, boy?" Tommy's eyes darted between the sheriff and Clayton, uncertain how much he should reveal. Doc's still examining what's left but the boots. They belong to Jake Morrison. You know, that drifter who's been hanging around Ward's place doing odd jobs for whiskey money? Sheriff Payne's expression darkened. Jake Morrison had been a harmless drunk, the kind of man who caused more trouble for himself than anyone else. But he'd been seen arguing with several of Ward's creditors in recent weeks. Men who weren't known for their patience with obstacles. So Morrison's dead, and Ward's vanished with whatever money he got from this trade. The sheriff mused his gaze, returning to Clayton. "Mighty convenient for your uncle, girl." The words were meant for Nora, though she remained hidden behind the kitchen wall. But Clayton answered instead, his voice carrying a warning edge. The girl had nothing to do with her uncle's business dealings. Maybe not, Sheriff Bain conceded, but those business dealings seemed to be following her. Makes a man wonder what kind of trouble she might bring to your doorstep, Clayton. One of the deputies leaned forward, his pale eyes gleaming with malicious interest. Could be she knows more than she's letting on about Ward's debts. His enemies maybe even who might want Morrison dead. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pea. Nora pressed herself harder against the wall, remembering the faces of the men who'd visited her uncle's house in recent months. Rough men with cold eyes and ready fists. Men who spoke in whispers about money owed and patience wearing thin. She did know things more than she wanted to admit, even to herself. She'd overheard conversations not meant for her ears, had seen documents quickly hidden when she entered rooms. Her uncle had been deeper in debt than anyone realized, and some of his creditors weren't the type to accept excuses or delays. Clayton's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "Sheriff, unless you have evidence that either of us committed a crime, I suggest you focus your investigation on the actual scene instead of harassing innocent people." Innocent. The sheriff's smile was sharp as broken glass. "That remains to be seen, but you're right about one thing. I do have a crime scene to investigate." He gathered his reins, preparing to leave. "But don't think this conversation is over, Clayton. The girl's presence here raises too many questions for my comfort." As the three lawmen prepared to ride toward the Ward property, Sheriff Bain turned back one final time. "One more thing, Clayton. If I were you, I'd be very careful about who I trusted. Sometimes the people we try to help bring more trouble than they're worth." The warning was clear. Nora was dangerous to know, a magnet for violence and suspicion. As the hoofbeats faded into the distance, Clayton remained on his porch for a long moment, staring at the dust clouds left in their wake. Finally, he turned toward the door, and Nora stepped away from the window, her heart pounding. When he entered the kitchen, his face was grim with the weight of new understanding. "We need to talk," he said simply. But before Nora could respond, another sound reached their ears. More hoofbeats approaching, but these were different. Slower, more deliberate, carrying the unmistakable rhythm of riders trying not to be heard. Clayton's hand moved instinctively to the gun on his hip as he moved to the window. The approaching riders weren't making any effort to announce themselves. Never a good sign in country where honest men called out their intentions from a distance. Through the gap in the shutters, he counted 3 figures moving through the scrub brush, trying to use the terrain to mask their approach. Nora felt ice settle in her veins as she recognized the lead rider's distinctive slouched posture. Marcus Doolan, one of her uncle's most persistent creditors, a man whose patience had run out weeks ago. Behind him rode 2 others she knew by reputation, if not by name, the kind of men who collected debts with brass knuckles and threats. "Get away from the window," Clayton commanded quietly. But Nora was already moving, her survival instincts honed by years of avoiding her uncle's dangerous associates. She pressed herself against the far wall, making herself as small as possible. Clayton checked his rifle, the metallic click of the action unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "These friends of yours, Uncle's creditors," Nora whispered, her voice barely audible. "Marcus Doolan and his boys? They've been pressuring him for months about money he borrowed for gambling debts." The admission hung between them like a confession. Clayton's jaw tightened as he understood the implications. Nora's uncle hadn't just traded her away to settle a debt with Clayton. He'd used the money from that trade to disappear, leaving his creditors empty-handed and looking for someone to blame. Outside, the riders had stopped just beyond rifle range, clearly visible now through the front windows. Marcus Doolan sat his horse with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to intimidating those weaker than himself. His weathered face bore the marks of countless fights, and his smile held no warmth whatsoever. Clayton Reeves. Doolan's voice carried clearly across the yard. "We need to have ourselves a conversation about Silas Ward's debts." Clayton remained silent, watching the 3 men through the window. They'd positioned themselves strategically, one covering the front approach. The others angled to cut off escape routes toward the barn or the back of the house. These weren't desperate amateurs. They'd done this before. "We know the girl's in there with you," Doolan continued. "Ward's niece. She might not owe us money directly, but she's all that's left of his family. Figure she might know where he ran off to with our cash." Nora's hands shook as she listened to Doolan's words. The logic was brutal, but simple. If they couldn't collect from Silas, they'd settle for whatever they could squeeze from his only remaining relative. It didn't matter that she was an innocent victim of her uncle's schemes. Clayton's voice, when he finally responded, carried the flat certainty of a man drawing a line in the sand. "The girl doesn't know anything about Ward's business, and she's under my protection now." Doolan's laughter was harsh and ugly. "Your protection. That's real noble, Reeves. But this ain't your fight. Send the girl out and we'll be on our way. Keep her, and this becomes your problem too." The threat was unmistakable. Clayton glanced back at Nora, seeing the terror in her green eyes. The way she hugged herself as if trying to disappear entirely. He'd faced down dangerous men before, but never over someone else's life. The smart play would be to hand her over and wash his hands of the whole mess. But as he looked at Nora's frightened face, Clayton found himself remembering another young woman years ago who'd needed protection that never came. The memory hit him like a physical blow. His sister Emma, barely 17 when the fever took her crying out for help that arrived too late. "She stays," Clayton said loud enough for Dulon to hear. "And if you're smart, you'll ride away now while you still can." The words committed him to a course of action that could get them both killed. But some lines once drawn couldn't be crossed without losing whatever remained of a man's soul. Outside, Dulon's expression shifted from confident to calculating. He'd expected Clayton to cave to choose his own safety over a girl he barely knew. The fact that Clayton was willing to fight changed the equation entirely. "Last chance," Reeves Doolin called out. "We came here for Ward's debts. Don't make this about something bigger than it needs to be." Clayton's response was to his rifle, the sound carrying clearly across the yard. It was answer enough. But as the three riders began to spread out, preparing for what would come next, Clayton realized that protecting Nora might require a sacrifice he wasn't sure he was prepared to make. The standoff stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Clayton positioned himself at the front window, rifle steady, while Nora crouched behind the heavy kitchen table. Outside, Dulon and his men had dismounted using their horses as cover while they evaluated their options. "You got about 30 seconds to reconsider," Reeves Dulon shouted. 3 against 1 ain't odds any sane man would take. But Clayton had already moved beyond the mathematics of survival. Something about Nora's quiet courage, the way she'd endured her uncle's cruelty without breaking, reminded him of everything he'd lost and everything he'd failed to protect. This time would be different. "Nora," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off the men outside. "There's a root cellar beneath the kitchen floorboards. Trapdoors hidden under that loose board by the stove." She looked at him with wide eyes, understanding immediately. "What about you? I'll handle this." His voice carried a finality that made her stomach clench. "But if something happens to me, you stay hidden until they leave, then get to town. Find Sheriff Vane. Tell him everything." The first shot shattered the front window, sending glass cascading across the floor. Clayton returned fire immediately, his bullet taking Dulon's hat clean off his head. The message was clear. This wasn't going to be easy prey. "Get down." Clayton barked as more shots peppered the front of the house. Wood splintered from the doorframe, and the acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air. But Nora didn't move toward the cellar. Instead, she grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the stove and positioned herself beside the back door. If these men wanted to take her, they'd have to earn it. Outside, she could hear Dulon cursing as he realized Clayton wasn't going to fold under pressure. "Burn them out," he yelled to his men. "Girl ain't worth dying for." The smell of smoke reached them first, wisps curling under the front door. One of Dulon's men had lit a torch and was approaching the house, clearly intending to set it ablaze. Clayton's next shot sent the man diving for cover, but the threat remained. They could be forced out into the open, where the odds would overwhelm them. That's when Nora made her choice. She stood up and walked to the front door, her chin raised with the dignity her uncle had never been able to crush. "I'm coming out," she called. "Leave Clayton alone." No, Clayton spun toward her, but she was already lifting the latch. "Enough people have died because of my uncle's debts," she said firmly. "I won't let you die too." But as she stepped onto the porch, hands raised, something unexpected happened. The sound of hoofbeats thundered from multiple directions. Sheriff Vane and a full posse arriving at exactly the right moment. Dulon and his men found themselves surrounded, their weapons suddenly useless against overwhelming odds. "Drop your guns." Vane commanded, his voice carrying the authority of the law. "You're all under arrest for attempted arson and assault." The fight went out of Dulon's men like air from a punctured balloon. They'd gambled on a quick resolution and lost everything. As the dust settled and the criminals were led away in chains, Sheriff Vane approached Clayton and Nora. "Seems like that fire at Ward's place was more connected to current events than we thought," he said. "Found evidence that Dulon's gang was behind it, probably trying to destroy proof of their illegal lending practices." Clayton lowered his rifle, finally understanding. Silas wasn't the target. He was just collateral damage. And the girl here was never really in debt to them. Vane continued. They were just desperate enough to try anything after Ward disappeared with their money. In the aftermath, as the sun began to set over the hills, Clayton and Nora found themselves alone again. But something fundamental had changed between them. The crisis had burned away pretense and revealed the truth. They were both survivors who'd found something worth protecting in each other. "You don't have to stay," Clayton said finally. "The danger's over now. You can make a new life in town." Nora looked at the ranch house, at the single plate on the table, at the man who'd risked everything for someone he barely knew. Or, she said quietly, "I could help you set a second place at that table." Clayton's smile was the first genuine one his face had worn in years. "I'd like that," he admitted. "I'd like that very much." For the first time in her life, Nora was worth more than livestock. She was worth a home protection and the respect of a good man. And Clayton had discovered that some kinds of wealth couldn't be measured in gold or cattle. Sometimes it came in the form of courage, wearing a faded blue dress. If you enjoyed this story of redemption and courage in the Old West,